OAG's EVP of Product Management. And we're delighted to be joined by Wilco Sweden, Head of Route Development at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. Welcome to the panel, and particularly to you, Wilco. I'm sure it must be an incredibly busy time for you right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody around the world. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we're looking forward to hearing from you as we go today. So as usual, we're going to use some OAG data and some analysis that we've done to provide an overview of what's happening in terms of air capacity and frequency at a regional and country level. And then we'll take a deeper look at what shifts we're seeing in capacity week on week, and in particular, how some airlines are responding. As I said, we're then have time to take your questions, so please do send those in to us using the question function. And everybody who is registered today and is listening in will receive a recording of the webinar, so please don't worry about missing anything. So let's jump right in. What we're looking at here is the global picture for flights in the map on the left. And I think we said a fortnight ago that whilst capacity fell off a cliff in countries around the world on the way down, recovery was going to be a much more gradual process, and that's really evident now. 2 weeks ago, global flights were 65% below last year for the week, and this week we're 63% down. Now at that rate, it's going to take quite a while, isn't it, John, before we see any green on this map?
Probably longer than it will take for Arsenal to win a game of football, Deirdre, but that's another story.
You managed to get a football reference in early today.
There you go, over and done with. Yes, it's going to be a long and very fragile journey out from this position. If we compare where we were this time last year, there were approximately 115 million seats being operated a week, and now we're just below that 40 million mark, which gives you some idea of the scale of gap that we need to cover and bridge in the foreseeable future. I think, as we'll see later, some of the issues are that in absolute terms, the numbers are pretty flat over the last couple of weeks, but there's a considerable amount of churn and devil in the detail. But I think the biggest concern we have, and that we would need to face, is what the future looks like, and specifically the next 6 or 7 weeks. And we'll cover that in more detail. But we have got so much capacity and so much uncertainty and a lack of clarity about what can be flown to what destinations. And although we see glimmers of optimism in Europe, and Wilco can speak in more details to some of those, we're just, we're still hemorrhaging, and this is the moment when airlines are supposed to be making their cash that will get them through next winter.
And this is a hint of that, isn't it? In terms of what we expected a couple of weeks ago that we would see at the end of June would be 53 million seats, and actually the latest data is now suggesting that weekly capacity by the end of June will be 40 million seats. So that's a big difference, isn't it, in just a very short space of time?
Absolutely. And if we look at just taking one region, Western Europe, if we look at the capacity that is still filed by airlines, and therefore they intend to operate next week, unless they've got plans they're not sharing with everybody, then there's literally tens of millions of seats that will be added back into networks next week. And you know what? It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, let's go down to that regional level then and see what's happening here. As you said, there's a lot of churn, isn't there? So North America actually saw a 1.5% percentage point move in a positive direction. Europe saw a 2.2% shift, and actually when you look at the position 2 weeks ago, Europe is I sort of hesitate to say quite considerably, but based on what we'd seen in the run up to that, that is quite a considerable shift in the right direction.
Yeah, it is. And that's good, and we'll speak about, you know, where's it coming from and who are the carriers that are making that
Yeah.
happen. Look at
It's
Asia.
this though. It's this, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
And this
where
downturn.
we we've suffered, of course, from the second spike of COVID-19 in Beijing, which
Hmm.
essentially has resulted in nearly 1 million domestic seats being taken out of that market in the space of 1 week. So, you know, the authorities have been very quick to act, but those million seats being taken out effectively nets off the benefit of additional capacity we've seen in
Yeah.
Europe and a little bit in North America. So in terms of global position, it's actually, you know, slightly deteriorated week on week. So it's a really frustrating situation, and I think this stop start is going to be a real dilemma for airports, and indeed for airlines as they try to build out and plan resources and networks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Wilco, that's it's going to be a challenge, isn't it, for you in terms of the restart of operations.
No, absolutely, and that's what we're seeing is that it's very slow. Europe was really bad in the last few weeks. We did see that as of the 15th of June, when there was a little bit more relaxation in the European market, that some airlines did try to pick up on that. So we are seeing destinations being flown again. Of course, the frequencies is still very low compared to what it was before that.
Yeah.
And I mean,
And
Wilco, one of the challenges we have in Europe, of course, is that we have very few large domestic markets. I mean, notwithstanding Spain, perhaps, and the Turkish domestic market. I mean, we are heavily reliant on international to international connectivity, aren't we?
That's right. Well, that's maybe the weakest spot that the Netherlands has, is that we don't have a domestic market being flown. But so we're very everything is international, but that is the case. And of course, there's a lot of pressure also within the EU, and you also see that with the German with the bailout of, let's say, Lufthansa or Air France, that there's also put a lot of pressure on, maybe even having to stop domestic flights. So that is also will also hurt an airline in the future.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Okay. Let's go on to our next slide, which is just expanding a bit on this point we made a couple of slides ago. So we've shown you this before if you're a regular listener, and this is really to continue to demonstrate that capacity for the short term is still really pretty volatile. So we're showing you here global capacity split by domestic and international. The dark blue line is 2019 by week, and this is just for the period to the end of July. So this really critical time for many carriers. Yellow is what was filed 4 weeks ago to the end of July, and orange 2 weeks ago, and then blue for this week for the same period. So globally this week, we have seen 34 million domestic seats come out, and that part of that is the China piece that you just referenced, John.
Yep.
And we're sitting at 51% below last year on this week-on-week comparison. And then internationally, the position is much worse, isn't it? So 67 million seats have come out in the last 2 weeks just
Absolutely.
for the.
And I think there is a real a crucial takeaway from this data and the pattern of activity we are seeing, which is really, you know, we shouldn't expect this summer to improve significantly, and these are the types of numbers that we will probably be seeing. Yes, when United Kingdom releases people out of quarantine and we get corridors and bubbles, we may see an upturn in some capacity. But you know, there are major markets around the world that are slower in handling the pandemic, and therefore the likelihood of capacity coming back quickly is quite low, and specifically that's places like Latin America, where the big Brazilian domestic market no longer exists. And I think we need to, I've seen some research overnight that says, the likelihood is that the US market, both for outbound international travel to Europe and from Europe to the United States, is probably going to be non-existent this summer because of the increase in outbreak of COVID-19 in the US. So the international situation is pretty grim, and as we'll see later, there are airlines who just have not put back any capacity because they cannot see a way out of this at this moment in time. And these,
or there are too many restrictions still in terms of their source markets.
Absolutely, and we are literally seeing billions of dollars of revenue that would be generated in these weeks just not occurring. And every airline seat is a perishable product. There is no way to recover that sum at a later point.
That's massively damaging, isn't it, for the cash flow of airlines around the world?
I think so, and it's important to recognise, and I have more concern now about the period from October this year through to probably April of next year for airline failures than I do at this moment in time. I can see many airlines who will make it through to the end of October, early November, because there is pent-up demand, but they will not have built cash reserves up to see their way through the winter periods.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Wilco. We were talking briefly yesterday, weren't we, about you are seeing some at Schiphol. You are seeing some international flights returning, but there are still repatriation. There's still repatriation traffic, isn't there? That's still happening.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when this all was starting, I think many airlines have reacted, of course, by firstly stopping their international routes. Some intercontinental airlines have continued to fly to Schiphol by sending in passenger aircraft filled only with cargo. So they were looking for new sources of revenue. There was a moment that, just as an idea, is that in a normal year we would have 3% of our aircraft movements would be full freighter aircraft, and in the new normal, so several weeks ago, 45% of our aircraft movements were full freighters. So that really shows. So the cargo has been moving around the world. There was a big demand. Amsterdam was seen also as a point to even connections. Even airlines from Latin America flew into Amsterdam to go to China to collect medical supplies, etc. The Dutch government was also more liberal in and also a quicker response to giving the rights to be able to fly. So I think that everybody was trying to be as flexible as possible. So yeah, maybe we as an hub airport became a hub cargo airport at the time. We were always that already, but cargo was still flowing through the airport. And also because there was less belly capacity in place. And over the last 2 weeks, we are seeing gradually that international flights are picking up, intercontinental flights. So belly capacity is being brought back in. And we are welcoming back our long-haul airlines into Amsterdam. So this week, Cathay Pacific restarted. Last week was Emirates restarted their flights, Etihad. And so we are seeing things are picking up again in that sense. So that's a good sign. Yeah.
And that's of course what an airport needs, isn't it? In terms of whilst from a revenue perspective, I guess you need passengers coming through your airport, spending in the shops, spending in the food and beverage outlets, and making the process work, really, don't you? And I think for many airports, cargo has been a means of keeping things operating in recent months, but actually airports need to get back to having passengers coming through their terminals, don't they?
Yeah, cargo doesn't buy many cups of coffee, does it? Or croissants in the morning.
No, they don't. No.
It's interesting. Jeremy Robinson, who's a legal expert, a brilliant advisor on aviation law, surprisingly listening because he doesn't normally get up this early, I know. But the word uncertainty is quite relevant, I think, because he makes the point: why would a passenger book at the moment? How could you have confidence to book when it's stop start, and certainly in Europe, getting your money back from an airline once you've purchased a ticket is extremely difficult. You know, they'll offer you vouchers, they'll delay paying you back, even though they're supposed to within 7 days, etc., etc. So that whole uncertainty throughout the industry, throughout the booking chain, is frustrating that growth recovery.
Yeah, it's still impacting significantly. Okay, let's take a look at this data for Asia Pacific. And I think what's interesting here is that, you know, we're seeing we haven't really seen this before, so this is really the impact of the second wave in Beijing, isn't it, right now? So we've seen 9.5 million seats in the Asia Pacific domestic markets come out for this time period for July. But actually, on the other side, and you know, I think maybe we have a sense that once that wave is under control, things will spike back up, because we've seen that with China, haven't we? It's a resilient market in terms of the domestic picture, but internationally, this is a real. It's a bit of a red flag, isn't it? You know, in terms of the amount of capacity.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of things here. I mean, the lockdown in Beijing has a knock-on effect into international capacity in Asia, because, you know, China was already restricting international services to 1 flight a week, with load factors capped. I think it was at 75%. So they're going to be more cautious than ever now about reopening international capacity. And although Wilco has seen Cathay come back, you know, they're one airline who still have most of their fleet grounded. Singapore Airlines in a very similar position. You know, there are a whole host of carriers in the Asia Pacific region. Qantas, who are not going to be flying any international services aside from to and from New Zealand. And it's that connectivity and it's that international network that is going to drive the recovery. And Mark's made the point before, you know, you need the international capacity and the international traffic to feed domestic capacity in markets such as Thailand, where they're hugely dependent on inbound tourism to stimulate and drive the economy.
Yeah, and it feels almost like we're now almost at the end of June, and as much as airlines have been, I guess, optimistically hoping that they're going to get, you know, like the week commencing 25th line or the week commencing 8th of June line, something like that build back coming, the kind of update over the last week just suggests, you know what, there's no chance we're going to get either the customer confidence back or the you know, propensity to buy tickets at the moment, and therefore, do you know what, July's just a write-off now, and we'll push it out to August, and hopefully we can maybe get the tail end of the summer at some point.
And that sort of leads nicely to my next slide, Mark, where this is that effect, isn't it? So what we're seeing here, we've taken the orange line off because, you know, there were too many really, getting too many. But what we're seeing here is, so we've still got 2019 back up to global here. We've got 2 weeks ago, and we've got this week. And, you know, you're just seeing the effect of here's July. And then, you know, is it credible really to expect that this picture is going to materialise?
I think to John's point about the winter as well, and that would be the concern, that you could almost, you know, take a straight line from
Couldn't you, from
commencing the 3rd of August right through to lower, and that might be a more realistic picture. But then, to
Yeah.
John's point, the impact on, you know, the cash reserves of airlines, if you take out, if you like, the cream on the top for those 2 or 3 months, means that the airlines that would have that cash flow for the winter don't. And what pressure does that put on the yellow line for the winter? I think is going to be.
Yeah, it's the unknown, isn't it?
Yeah, it's unknown, but I think it could still be quite dramatic.
And I think, you know, in the same way that you could potentially extrapolate that trend over there, I don't know that there's any kind of certainty about what this picture would look like. You know, I mentioned earlier that capacity and frequency fell off a cliff at the beginning of this, and if you think back to the slide that we showed with the regional, you know, flights by region, that shows that really steep jump. This is the other side, and I think we're all of us are saying this is very unlikely, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you know, the previous slide sort of is that mild S that you're seeing in the yellow coming back, but that could be quite a
and you'll note that we haven't attempted any kind of forecast to what that might look like, because, you know, the reality is it's incredibly hard to predict.
And even carriers, you know, was it yesterday, Virgin announcing looking to restart the long haul late July, with Hong Kong and Shanghai and some of their other markets coming into August, taking a bit of a guess that they might be able to get some volume back through, but it really is just a guessing game at the moment.
And I think you never should forget that capacity is one thing, but what about the load factors? They will still be, you didn't put them in this picture, but that will still be devastating for the airlines and the airports in general.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we've sort of talked in previous webinars, Wilco, about what might the passenger experience look like in terms of social distancing and all of those sorts of things. But I guess the reality is the passengers have to have the confidence to step back into the airports, don't they?
That's right. Yeah, so I think everybody's still waiting to see and also relying on the right advices from the governments. I mean, you got the lockdowns, but it's also, I mean, in our case, the 15th of June was kind of like an opening up of the European market. So we have seen over the last few weeks growth, especially in the European market, because like airlines like Transavia really stepped in as quickly as possible to offer capacity to the southern part of Europe, and the Dutch market has responded pretty well on that. And I don't know if it's because they're brave and young or whatever, but we are seeing that passengers do want to go that way. And if you walk through Schiphol now, of course, it is. I'm not saying it's a ghost town, because but you do see here and there flights going out. Mouth masks are now, you have to wear a mouth mask if you can't keep the 1.5 meters distance. And it seems to be working okay. Of course, we don't want any further outbreaks in that sense, but it seems that everybody is also following the rules, and I think that's a good thing. So at least it gives the confidence a little bit back.
Yeah, good. Well, it's good to hear. And I think it's always encouraging to hear that there is some demand for travel. I think particularly where we're sitting right now in the UK, still hampered by quarantine, it's hard to imagine the ability to get back on a plane and travel freely somewhere. So
I'm not sure we are. Deirdre, I'm not sure we are hampered by quarantine. I think everyone who's supposed to be in quarantine is playing golf at the moment and just taking a moment. Well,
allegedly.
That's what Michael O'Leary told us. So it must be true.
Yeah. Okay.
It must be true.
Yeah. Let's look at our next slide. So coming back to Asia Pacific again for a few moments. This is one of our usual slides that our usual tables that we look at. So we're showing here, just as a reminder for those of you who might not have seen this before, We're showing scheduled flights compared to last year, and we're now into months rather than weeks. We've got the month-on-month picture and then the week-on-week picture for the last 4 weeks. And I think it, again, this sort of illustrates the impact of the China situation, doesn't it, John? So you've got this step back there.
Yep.
But actually, there's not much else in terms of improvement, with the exception of Vietnam.
No, there isn't. And Vietnam has been, for probably the last 5 or 6 weeks, a bit of a best case study in terms of improvement and scheduling and load factors. I was just looking at this and reflecting on Hong Kong, and in January, capacity on flights was down by 10%. Year on year anyway, because of the ongoing civil disruption and disputes in Hong Kong. And actually, I think that probably goes back now to I think it was about September of last year when that began to occur.
Yeah.
So, if you are one of the 3 locally based airlines, of which clearly Cathay Pacific is the largest, your market has been disrupted for nearly 12 months. And the impact of that will be extremely severe. And you look at where Hong Kong is now, and it was one of the first markets to reach this, less than 10% of capacity being used. It was down at 93% in April.
Early,
It's staggered back up to 90%. The disruption to the balance sheets and the cash reserves in that particular market must be staggering. And there are other cases. Australia clearly is not going to improve very much further without international traffic. Similarly, New Zealand, both of which are best case examples of handling the COVID crisis, but have publicly said no more international capacity for the time being. So it's a pretty grim situation. And even Japan, that -41, as we will see later, there are some very strange airline behaviours taking place in the Japanese market at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's just, we need to break through somewhere. We need to break through.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a little bit of a look at China specifically. Someone's actually asked a question, or it's a comment really rather than a question about, it's such a paradox that China is still the least affected market. I think the reality is that the volume of China's domestic market meant that what we saw in terms of recovery was always going to be the case, wasn't it?
It is. And if you go back 6 or 7 slides and you look at the market, the regional markets and the reductions we saw there, Asia was never as badly affected, or has not been as badly affected in terms of capacity as any other region in the world. And the motivation and the drivers behind that are a combination of China and Japanese domestic capacity. And we've said one of the really early learnings in this whole event has been, if you've got a domestic market of scale and size, then you are more likely to see that capacity remain than international services, because generally domestic capacity of that scale reflects a very large geographic market where people have no other alternate mode of transport.
And that's the US picture as well, isn't it? I mean, we're not really looking at North America this morning.
No.
If you want some insights on
Turkey as well,
come back this afternoon. But Turkey as well, yeah.
We have to come back this afternoon. Come and join us.
We do. So I think what we just wanted to show here was that yes, we're seeing a spike down this week, but we have seen that before. It hasn't been a straight line in terms of Chinese recovery, and we wanted to just show the impact really of this. Is just cancellation data. The yellow line is cancellations for Beijing and Daxing in the last week.
Yeah.
And that's just, it's an immediate short, sharp shock, isn't it? You know, in
Absolutely.
terms of
And you know,
stopping.
what is really interesting is clearly, you know, this is the last 7 to 10 days of historical flights operated and cancelled. So you can see how quickly the authorities and the airlines moved to cancel flights and stop the spread into other Chinese cities. And if you look at the rest of China in terms of cancellation rates and capacity, it's very much
10%.
business as usual.
Yeah.
You know, it's business as new normal usual.
Yeah, new normal usual. Yeah, it's not 1%, it's 10%.
No, it's not 1%, it's 10%. But that's much
given that
better
we were at
than
30%, it's yeah, that's the new normal, isn't it?
Yeah. So you know, if you go on, Mark.
It just kind of plays to, I guess, what Wilco said, you know, about it's one thing having, you know, capacity and the flights coming back. It's another thing, what's the actual underlying demand? And in a market like China, which was, or it has been largely ahead of the rest of the world in terms of their experience of this and trying to build back out from it, you know, running at sort of 10% plus cancellations for a prolonged period of weeks. In a market that's maybe, you know, got a little bit more confidence, then what does that tell us about some of the other big markets that even as they start to build out, you know, they're going to be running at maybe 8, 10, 15% cancellations for a sustained period of time. And the challenge then, not just for the airline, but every single associated industry that relies on those passengers coming through, it's huge, right?
And how will that all sit with the slot 80 use it and lose it 80-20 rules, not just for the winter? I mean, I've already seen people saying what's going to happen in summer 21, you know, that we need more flexibility around those types of operating rules.
And actually, you know, I suppose my expectation slightly is that if we came back in, you know, well, when we come back in 2 weeks' time, maybe we'll include this slide again, or even in 4 weeks' time, depending on how long this situation lasts. I think we'll just see that recover. You know, I think we'll see it spike back up. Cancellation rate will drop back to the new normal. My question, the sort of unanswered question for me is, what would we see in other parts of the world? You know, I think it would be quite different because, you know, we're seeing that in all the other indicators. We're seeing just this stalling of recovery, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a good time to be an airport or an airline.
Well, the difficulty about having all these cancellations last minute is, of course, that the airport, of course, the airline is losing a lot of money on that also, but for the airport, it's very difficult to really plan ahead on what to do and which resources have to be used, security staff that have to be prepared. In our case, in Amsterdam, of course, we first scaled down to what we called the core Schiphol, only using part of the airport, using 3 piers at for the operation, but we now have to kind of scale up again to use the whole airport. One, because we need more space to have the social distancing, and secondly, we do see traffic picking up, but we are of course very dependent on what the airlines are planning ahead 1 or 2 weeks ahead of us. So we're really reliant on reliable data and schedules from the airlines.
Wilco, you used to, I mean, Schiphol is built on a series of banks, isn't it? Is it 5 or 6 banks, waves a day? But how are you seeing some sort of wave structure being created at the moment, or do you think it's a bit more sort of random and scattergun than that?
Well, maybe interesting. I think maybe it gets all maybe cramped more closer to each other because what we see is that the frequency to various destinations, of course, is less. So if you do want to give a certain connection opportunity, that means that you don't want the passenger to wait 24 hours to make that connection. And also, I think passengers are not really keen on staying at an airport during these periods for too long time, because maybe there are also less facilities, or how safe is it? So we do see a lot of connecting still going on. I mean, Delta and KLM have a close cooperation during the whole period. They have been still offering flights to the US and using KLM's network to the European market. We heard, sorry, KLM intends to pick up on their destinations in the European market, intercontinental. So in the lowest point, they were about flying to 25 European destinations and 35 intercontinental destinations. And in June, it's 45. And their ambition is to go kind of back to normal European destinations in August, and about 55 of flights, 55, sorry, destinations intercontinental. And the way they're doing it is also that they're of course monitoring what's allowed to be flown, when passengers are allowed to fly, and if not, then the cargo is, let's say, maybe also the way to at least make it a little bit profitable in that sense, or to cover the cost. But I think they're using it to at least have their network back in place.
I think that's the challenging thing, isn't it? You know, we heard a couple of weeks ago from Finnair about the difficulty in keeping track of all of the different country positions about what's allowed and who can travel where, and you know, increasingly we're seeing what's the consequence of if a flight arrives with passengers who might test positive or fail the temperature checks. One of the questions that someone's actually asked is, aside from, you know, face masks and things, what things have Schiphol anticipated having to do to increase passenger confidence?
Yeah, I think it's also giving good instructions. Let's say the Schiphol staff themselves have, over the last few days, weeks, also, stickers on the floor, trying to make sure that people are walking in the right direction. I mean, I think in the UK it's very normal to queue up and things like that. That's not the case in other parts of the world. So yeah, we have to maybe educate the passengers a little bit more. But I think it's trying to make sure that the hygiene is important. We now have the vending machines that usually were selling Coca-Cola or chocolate bars have been refurbished, and they're now dispensing packages so that you have your face masks or gels or whatever. So it is those type of things that trying to give the confidence back and to make sure that everybody is, firstly, that, of course, that we're following the regulations, but also to bring back the confidence to the passengers once they're at the airport. So that's, and maybe, I mean, it says even China's second wave, but at Schiphol, the second wave of the 7-wave system we had in the past is kind of like the busiest part still. So that's in the morning. Just to go back to a question before that.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the sort of second part, really, for us. Excuse me, the noise of my barking dogs in the background. If anybody heard that, so I might as well just acknowledge it. Hopefully they'll be quiet now. Let's have a look at, John mentioned earlier that we were going to take a look at how airlines are responding differently to this situation. What we're showing here, and those of you who read the blog, the OEG blog this week, will have spotted this table, or these two tables. What we're showing here is based on a threshold of carriers who were operating 500,000 seats in a week or more, as of the week of the 20th of January. So those are the airlines that are in this pool for comparison. Here are the 10 airlines who are adding back the most capacity this week versus the position at the beginning of January or the middle of January. And then here are the airlines who are essentially at the bottom of that table and have added back the least amount of capacity.
Yep.
And there's just some interesting parallels, John, or some comparisons here, aren't there?
Yeah, it's firstly, we put a criteria on here of about 500,000 seats per week being operated, so that we avoided some of the sort of background data and wild swings in percentage changes that you can sometimes see in this type of information. But I think it's really interesting when you see who leads in terms of capacity growth or recovery during this period, and Wizz Air are an absolute standout. Now, you know, in the middle of a northern hemisphere winter, third week of January, their capacity would probably be at its lowest point anyway, because there just wouldn't be demand. So to have moved from 700,000 up to 837,000 seats a week now is a combination of both, this is the height of the northern hemisphere summer, so you would expect them to be very busy, but also an outrageously bullish perspective on the market. This sort of approach makes Ryanair look like one of the most cautious airlines in the world.
We'll come to that on our next slide.
They are opening bases at a phenomenal rate. It's extremely ambitious. I am not sure that the load factors are following this particular growth curve. And there is probably a lot of empty seats moving around, but there is no airline that has been more bullish about it. But
the cancellation rate's not bad, though. I mean, I can't actually believe I said that, given that this time last year a cancellation rate of 18%
absolutely
would have been appalling.
Only one in 5 flights are cancelled.
You know.
So but that in itself, I just if I were an investment analyst, I think if he was to see this picture and accepting that they have one of the lowest cost bases in the world, an investment analyst looking at that for a company that is on the stock market would be concerned about what this is doing to their cash reserves at this moment in time.
It's not sustainable, is it?
From my perspective, it's not, and I'd love them to come on and tell us that it is sustainable and it will work out. But I do have my doubts. And another one who's followed a very similar path is Qatar Airways, who for an airline that has no domestic market, operates a classic hub network connecting west to east and east to west, and is so dependent on international lockdowns. There must be a lot of flights, to Wilco's point earlier, that are essentially repatriation services and therefore probably only capable of carrying traffic in one direction. So again, really slightly alarming. And All Nippon, 37% cancellation rate at this moment in time. This used to be an airline that won the OAG on-time performance awards for Asia, and they're cancelling one in every 3 flights now. In Japan, you can probably do that because these are high frequency markets, with flights every 45 minutes or so, but even it's quite dramatic. And then sure.
No, I was just going to kind of back on Wizz Air. Is it, I guess, one side to be cautious and concerned, but is this maybe just a fairly transparent, calculated gamble by them and their investors, that if we go in now, we're going to kind of keep our foot on the neck of competition, and maybe look, this is a this is a loss leader for us. We accept that, but we're going to be in the strongest position as we get into winter, and the competition are not going to be able to survive as a result. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing that out.
I mean, it's an interesting strategy because they have had good cash reserves, and first mover advantage, and as you say, putting your foot on the pedal. And someone has actually said they flew Vienna Rome yesterday with Wizz, and the plane was full. Rodolfo, if you wouldn't mind telling us how much you paid for your ticket, that would be quite interesting as well. But at the other end of the spectrum, the airlines who just have not come back into the market now, some Avianca probably aren't going to come back into the market until Chapter 11 is resolved for them, and that may be some way away. But you know, EasyJet,
Yeah.
British Airways, quarantines clearly impacting them as it is Ryanair. Three of those airlines are part of the IAG group, and you know, they've been very strong about how deep their cash reserves are. But are they being too cautious in their approach? Are they going to miss the market for the reasons that Mark said about first mover advantage? It's really fascinating. Rodolfo paid 70
It's
euros.
very fair.
Yeah, Rodolfo paid 70 euros return. If you net off the airport charges, and if you didn't buy a cup of coffee, Rodolfo, you probably gave Wizz Air about 20 euros of that, I suspect.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at a bit more into this comparison then between, and we've got to do Wizz and Ryanair, haven't we? Because again, I can't ever imagine that we would have been making this kind of comparison in this context. But we took a look to, I guess, to build on the point you were saying, John, about it's, you know, the seasonality is important. We took a look at what this week looks like compared to the same week last year for both carriers in terms of how many market pairs they're operating and frequencies and seats. And you can see right there, actually, there's a growth in market pairs being operated, and that's, you know, we've heard about new bases and new routes that are operating. Almost the same level of frequency, so they're nearly there, aren't they, in terms of last year, and actually slightly more capacity. And it just almost doesn't bear comparison, does it, to where Ryanair are right now?
No, and you know, Ryanair is remains very dependent on international services from the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, and of course, you know, traffic between those two countries, and they're just locked down. And if Michael O'Leary had any hair, he would be pulling it out at this moment in time. You know, it must be so frustrating for them, and to see one of their biggest rivals back in the market with that type of network, you know, and perhaps taking advantage of being the first to market and gaining a foothold. That's going to be worrying him, I think. They compete, as we say, on 48 routes, so they're pretty head to head in some countries and some markets. It's an interesting.
It's going to be interesting to follow that development, isn't it? And then we've done the same for Qatar and Emirates. So, you know, we've got Qatar operating 70% of their network, as you said, John, although, you know, more insight into how much of that is one-way traffic, I guess, would be interesting. They're operating about 3/4 of last year's levels in terms of frequency and capacity, with a slightly higher seats per aircraft and a similar frequency to last year. Emirates really are just still operating a minimal service, aren't they? Just 6% of last year's capacity.
Yeah, they are, and it is for both of these carriers. It is about balancing that network structure as well. You can't just add all new or return to destinations in the Western Hemisphere without adding services in Asia and other points. And you know, it's great that Emirates are beginning to rebuild, and Schiphol and Wilco's obviously got a Emirates service back in tow, but it's a long way to go. And of course, part of Emirates' dilemma is their high dependency on the A380, and putting that beast of an aircraft back into. A lot of
seats to fill, isn't it?
Absolutely, lots of seats to fill. Wilco, out of interest, what are Emirates operating on your service at the moment?
They're flying 777 at this moment. So they're using the 777, and that also has advantage that it has good cargo capacity. We did hear that they do have plans to fly their A380s to Europe again. So you never know if they will come back with the A380. I mean, and maybe just to mention about the A380, we still have an A380 every week from China Southern, flying from Guangzhou to Amsterdam every week. And that has, of course, to do with the policy of China, that only one route once a week. And so they put in their largest aircraft to be able also to the 75% load factor is of course one of their requirements. But the flights are full, so it is a lot of repatriation flights connecting through Amsterdam to get back to China.
And you know, when I look at the Qatar Airways network, and if you go on any of the flight tracking type sort of apps and visualizations, the amount of capacity that they continue to operate on ultra long haul services to Doha from the United States and into Doha from Australia, if those are repatriation flights, you know, they are very long sectors for essentially one-way type demand.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that, you know, they must, I know the price of oil is very cheap and they've got lots of it, but that doesn't mean you should drain the well.
Yeah, but they were the only ones offering it, and I think that's maybe the first mover. They were not even a first mover because they just kept moving. But like I think KLM's strategy is trying to also be a first mover in that sense by putting in place their network again. So claw back the destinations and then pick up on the frequencies once you see that the demand is picking up in that sense.
And I think that's easy. It's easier for someone like KLM and Amsterdam Schiphol, where you know you have a carrier, and if you consider Europe as a domestic market, most destinations KLM serve in Europe are multiple frequency, aren't they? So they're 3, maybe even 5 or 6 times a day, if not more. So you can add back that one a day, but when you have a long haul international network where you are connecting medium to long haul destinations to medium to long haul destinations, and you know the big 3 in the Middle East certainly fall into that category. Most destinations are probably only served maybe once a day, and therefore you either bring it back or you don't bring it back, and you can't grow out. You either have to put it all in or you don't have any of it in, and that maybe is the dilemma.
And that's what we're seeing, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot is also taking consideration on what are the rules and regulations of the country itself. So I think like the UAE and I also know that of Hong Kong, if the connection cannot be offered within 4 or 5 hours, you're not allowed to sell it to the passenger. So so that of course also makes it more difficult in that sense. So maybe Qatar and Doha did not have that necessity, so they were able to offer longer connecting times. But in other countries, but other airports have that limitation.
And do you have such limitations, Wilco?
No, not in that sense. I mean, of course, it's not the idea that the passenger stays 2 days to make their connection. But I think if the connection is done in that day, then that shouldn't be a problem. Yeah.
Right.
I think there's also the added, as we've sort of referenced throughout, the added overlaid situation that some markets are just not back open for tourists yet. And I think Dubai are talking about early next month, which is just a couple of weeks away, as being quite pivotal for them in terms of reopening. So if we revisit this in 2 weeks' time, we might see a different picture. But there's this underlying concern structurally, isn't there? I mean, one of the questions we've had from Daniel is how compromised do we think the hub and spoke model is for full service carriers like Emirates and other legacy carriers?
Well, I replied to Daniel directly. I said, no idea, mate, ask a consultant. But I guess it depends on the network structure to a huge degree. If you've got a balance between international and domestic connectivity, and I think of Istanbul as a great example where it has a domestic market as well as an international market, then you're at less risk. And then you could go on to say, well, actually, perhaps Amsterdam is at risk. But if you treat the whole of a Schengen market as a domestic market, and it is a domestic market because no one needs to show a passport unless you're a British or an Irish national, then that's a domestic market as well with multiple frequencies. I think it is a truly international to international hubs where we are going to see some capacity changes or maybe even structural changes. Emirates have said the A380 perhaps isn't the aircraft of the future after all, which is sort of finally listening to what everyone else has said for the last 15 years. I don't know, Wilco, what do you think? You sit on a very successful hub in Europe that works.
Yeah, well, I think of course there is still a future for hub and spoke. I mean, certainly in these times, as I mentioned, KLM is trying to put in those destinations. That means that they are able to connect the dots, because there are some destinations that can't be connected at all. So maybe in the coming months, it would be more logical to go through a hub airport, because that's the only way to get to a smaller point in Europe or in Asia, and or else you only would have a frequency of once every 2 weeks instead of maybe every 2 or 3 days. So I think that's the way forward for that. And as I mentioned, the cargo element is also helps in making it at least bringing some revenues in that sense. So that also helps for an airline like KLM to do that. And on the other hand, then we see still the point-to-point traffic demand that's still there. I mentioned Transavia seen a very good response on their offerings, that the Dutch market is responding to it. And we're getting we also know that from the Turkish market, there's a lot of demand to open up that, but that's of course a little bit different situation. But that, once people get more trust in that things are safe again to travel, then I think it will pick up very quickly in that sense. But everything will be focused on visiting family and relatives and going on holidays. And the business market will take probably a longer time to step up.
It's interesting, isn't it, that, Wilco? Because I think, maybe at the outset of this, we had a sense that maybe the business market would be impacted by, to a great extent by everybody realizing all of a sudden that, you could do business by video or by Zoom or whatever alternative you were using. Then there was a bit of fatigue in terms of, not another video meeting.
Not another OAG webinar, Deirdre.
Yeah, then there's a sense of actually there's some business that you can only really do in person. But actually for business now, the debate it's much broader, isn't it? It's around, is it safe for my staff to go to the country that I need them to go to? Will they have to quarantine when they get back or when they're there? And actually that's just really making it really hard for business to
there are so many complexities, and at the end of all of those complexities are airlines and airports trying to find a way through this. So we touched upon the fact sometimes it's bilateral issues that have suddenly emerged that need to be resolved. Sometimes it's things about ownership and all sorts of issues around slots and opening hours, and the airlines and the airports are in many cases at the mercy of the regulators, and not just the aviation regulators, but the health and port authorities and government policy, etc., etc. And it's extremely tough for an airline to see its way through that, and an airport to work with those parameters and offer a reliable and safe product.
Yeah. No, that's true, and that's why for us as an airport, it's really important to keep communicating to the airlines. So we have been sending out a lot of operational updates in fact, all the measures that have been taken or have to be taken. Trying to keep in contact with the airlines, as I said, about what are your schedules and what are your plans. So in that sense, we even have a special part on our website too, so everything is, you can see it to collect the latest information on that. So try to be as transparent as possible to make it as easy as possible for the airlines to at least get more confidence into the market.
Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious of time. We're at 9 o'clock now. If you have to drop off, then as I said earlier, don't worry, you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording of the audio. Are there any final points you want to take, John? Any questions you've got a burning desire to answer? There's a few.
I have a question for Wilco, and it would be, what have you and Schiphol learned from this event? What would be, let's hope we're never going to see anything like this again, but what is the one thing that you've learned as a takeaway? Is it constant communication and relationships with your airlines and working on those? Is it, providing information as quickly and as accurately as possible? Is it about building confidence? What's the thing that you think's been the best learning from it all, Wilco?
Well, I think that once a crisis happens, I think things get stronger. The relationships get stronger. In the beginning, maybe everybody's kind of what's happening, but I think everybody is keen on working together, so it's quicker. I think I also gave that example about that the government, maybe in bilateral relations on bilateral traffic rights, that they were more flexible in giving that. So the rules and regulations, instead of saying, well, usually it takes you 2 weeks to give an approval on something, that could be done very quickly. That's maybe those things we can learn from that and keep that also in mind when things pick up again, that we can be flexible and we can respond quicker than we did in the past, and we don't have to go back to the old standard in that sense. So and I think airlines have been flexible also. I mean, I mentioned it sometimes already that the cargo market really stood up, helping airlines to at least get some revenues. I think that maybe shows a general network planner of an airline that cargo should take cargo into consideration more than only the passenger volume. It's not an add-on; it's a plus. And it's a 1 + 1 is 3. If you take that into consideration, you can keep flying to a destination that you probably thought was not profitable. So, but I think we've heard that from other airlines also.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are specific routes I know from various projects and consultancy pieces I've worked on where cargo has turned a dog into a star when you put the right aircraft on a route.
Yeah. So they're very welcome to do that for Amsterdam. Yeah.
What? Do some consulting for you? Okay, let's have a chat.
Yeah,
from boom to bust and from dog to star. I think on that note, we'll leave it there this week. I think that's all we've got time for. Unfortunately, I'm sure we could be here for much longer, listening to your insights, Wilco. Thank you both, John and Wilco and Mark, for joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts on industry insight and wisdom. If we haven't managed to answer your question during the webinar, we'll do our best to do so in the next few days. And as we've already said, a recording of the webinar will be going out to everybody later today. Please remember that some of the data that we've talked through this morning, the tables and the insights, are published every week on OAG's website, and you can sign up for the blog. So the hard work that John does every Sunday morning, very early, putting together his thoughts, can pop into your inbox automatically. There's also a new feature on OAG's dedicated coronavirus page, where we have started OAG On Air. So there's a podcast where, if you haven't had enough of listening to John this morning, you can listen to him interviewing the CEO of airBaltic this week to capture some reflections and thoughts on how airBaltic are responding to the current challenge. So an interesting listen if you have a spare 30 minutes or so at some point. Thanks again for everybody for all the interesting questions, and thanks for listening, and we will no doubt see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.